So this one was really fun. If you've seen other videos of mine, you might know that I mentioned an idea to create the mechanical sounds of Castlevania using a wind-up toy. I wanted to make the sound of large gears a la some of the movement machinery in the titular Castlevania, being that Castlevania within the lore of that world is actually a moving castle. Or like in a clock tower of sorts. In my previous video, where I discussed my creative process overall, this would be answering the step 0 and 1 of the process for this project. I was aiming to make large mechanical sounds with a lot of depth, fitting of steampunk machinery. Unlike a lot of my other projects that had a benchmark in mind, I didn't actually end up referencing any material from Castlevania. I figured if I was unhappy with the result, I could easily take that moment to reference other work for inspiration and analysis. I ended up being extremely pleased through the whole process. My original brainwave, answering step 2 of the process from the previous video, how do I make that sound, was to use a wind-up toy. I didn't end up using a wind-up toy because I was unable to find one at the dollar store. So what I brainstormed as an alternative, which ended up being a better choice anyway, I think, was to use the iron in my house. It happens to have a nice wind-up mechanism for the power cord. And the sound, I think, is a lot deeper and gives me more to work with than a wind-up toy would have been. A cheap wind-up mechanism might have been a little chattery and maybe a little too noisy once I tried to work with it. Then came recording and manipulation, which would be step 3 in my earlier video. I planned to approach this as I've done with a lot of other sounds, where it was largely just the original sound in parallel with pitch-shifted versions of the sound. And of course, EQ treatment. Another layer of this, similar to what I did with the Capgun video, where I did a time distortion to extend and give it a little bit of low end and natural decay. This time I approached that conceptually with reverb instead. In part to give some extended decay, but also just because I imagine this being in a room. Very early on, I conceived the idea that I would end up making a soundscape rather than just a sound for a single gear mechanism. So I'll be showing off both the sounds individually and their summation, plus with the reverb processing also. So allow me to take you on a quick tour of what happened in this session. You can see up here my two, source tracks. First, individual raw, being named such just because I was trying to get the sample from the iron wind-up mechanism, as discreetly as possible, just like a single wind, in case I wanted to, be more granular with editing it together. It didn't end up being much of an issue to edit it whenever it was in series, quickly pooled, which you can see here, as the second track, where I also pulled samples from. With that, let's start on just, I guess, the, mid-speed one that I did. That was pulled from the series track. I believe it's this sample. Yes. So this is what just that... Okay. I copied that into its own track that I put down here. It's the looped one. And then just outside of a little bit of... Actually, I didn't even do any EQ on it, I guess. Because I figured I would just use it in parallel with other EQ-treated tracks. I looped it a lot. Wasn't necessarily exact in my looping. I figured a little bit of variation would be nice, so, the placement, the alignment of where it starts over layers over itself a little bit differently every few times. my approach ended up being pitch shifting. And appropriate EQ treatment. You'll notice maybe that there's another track in this routing folder at the bottom that's muted. I experimented for a minute with generating some lower tones, and having it side-chained so that the sine wave that I was producing would only trigger whenever the sample was triggering. But I wasn't very happy with the result. It's entirely just a bunch of pitch shifted and EQ treated tracks. And you can see some of my EQ curves here. I found that I was getting a lot of like a plexiglass or like metal like cookie sheet kind of thunder sound that like if you wobble the sheet with some of the more lower pitch stuff, kind of like a spank sometimes even. And so like my EQ curves are sometimes a little extreme on these, just to filter out a lot of that. And get exactly what I wanted out of each one. The result's not perfect, but I think it did a pretty good job. You can hear some artifacts every now and then, but all around it's pretty nice. And that's really how all of these were done. Once I had that first mid-speed one down to a state that I liked it, I copied that routing folder just as a template to work with other samples. The only other thing being, kind of as a last step for each one of these, I did some split processed left and right EQ, just to give it a little bit more space. And then I did a little bit of panning also, just like on the routing folder itself, just to give a little bit more space to this soundscape. But yeah, split processing is a great way to add fake space to a sound, because it can make it sound like it's a bigger item than it really is, in context to where you're standing. But yes, that's how all of these were done. I did different treatments for each sound, but the process, once I had the template in place, was it was a breeze. The sample for that faster one comes from the same take up here, but just of a faster part. That's what it sounded like by itself. And I love how you can tell how much all the pitch shifting really does to add depth to this. The tick-tock of, like, the clock, that came from the original up here. I did kind of want, like, a tick-tock, and that happens to be a nice sample for doing that. And so that's how it sounds processed. As with all of these, I gave different EQ treatments, depending on kind of like, just to give more space and put things in different places, sort of as an EQ thing, or panning. And so, summed, these all sound like this. The last step for me was to just add some reverbs for each one. I knew I wanted some pre-delay to like add an illusion of a bigger space. A lot of it was just kind of messing around with what happened to not clash too much with other reverb and not make things too muddy. And so this is what it sounds like with all the reverb. The reverb also got some split processed EQ treatment for the same reasons. I did consider, in another video I mentioned I might try to use my necklace, the chain, just to add more metallic sounds. I tried that, and it was just too thin to really work with. It sounded more like just beads on a table. And in my head, I was imagining the sound of like chains on shackles. And just like throwing that in might be a pretty cool layer that I would experiment with if I were going to do this again. I am very happy with how this sounds. This turned out so much cooler than I expected it to. I was going to tack on all of the sounds isolated at the end of this, but in the interest of keeping video length down, I'm actually going to put that all into its own video. Makes it easier for you to view the process separate from all the compositing. And I figured the samples that came through on my internal routing setup for filming this video actually came through pretty well. So, see you in the other video.